Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. Today I'd like to talk about an interview which I recently watched and thought it to be quite interesting of a Ukrainian journalist with Alexander Lukashenko, the President of Belarus. Usually in Western media one doesn't hear much about Lukashenko, except that he's a dictator, that he is in cahoots with Putin, that he has a military alliance with Russia, and not much else, that there's an opposition that supposedly is for democracy, is trying to overthrow him, and he's a repressive ruler, etc., etc., etc. However, what's interesting in this regard is that it is in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, that the original Minsk Accords between Ukraine and Russia were signed many years ago in 2014 and then 2015. And then, of course, if these accords had worked, then there would have been no war. So in that sense, Lukashenko established himself as a go-between, as a person who has a stake in the peaceful resolution of the conflict. And so far, Belarus has not been involved in military action, even though Putin was trying to nudge Lukashenko towards participation in this war. Now, there are several important details that came up during this interview, and what I'd like to title this presentation is Lukashenko's prediction or Lukashenko's advice to President Zelensky in terms of what has happened, what is happening now, and what is likely to happen in the future. So it's a little excursion into the past, the assessment of the situation today, the present, and that what Lukashenko feels there's going to be an outcome in the future. Now, what's also came out quite interesting is that Lukashenko's personal background, his family is from the Chernigov area, which is northern Ukraine on the border with Belarus. So in a sense, he's kind of like strictly speaking Ukrainian, although at that time nobody used this term, and there was one country, and it was the Soviet Union, and they were all Soviet. But nevertheless, geographically speaking, it's this border area between Ukraine and Belarus that he's from. And so he doesn't hide his very, very strong sentiment for Ukraine. He's sympathetic he kept repeating and repeating that he feels sorry for the Ukrainian people, that they're great people, that's a rich country. He keeps saying that it's so much richer than Belarus, which is geographically in the wooded area, and Ukraine in the south. It has this fantastic land and agriculture and hardworking people. So he went out of his way to portray himself as an admirer of Ukraine and Ukrainian people, and this is why the war he felt had to be found a compromise to avoid it in terms of the previous Minsk Accords. About the Minsk Accords, he was asked by the Ukrainian journalist Diana, and that is whether they would have held if Zelensky tried to honor them, unlike President Poroshenko, who was before him and who signed these accords. And what's interesting is that in the judgment of Mr. Lukashenko, Zelensky appeared to be, at the very beginning of his tenure of office, he appeared to be trying to revive the Minsk Accords and trying to make it work. But then apparently what happened is that he fell under the sway of the supranationalists, exactly in the same way as was Poroshenko, and then began to play the rough hand of no accords and military solution, fighting the Russians to the end. Now, in the judgment of Lukashenko, this was a big mistake, and he was trying to reason with him, hoping that he would listen perhaps to this interview, or that this idea would come to him. He basically said, look, you Ukrainians made a big mistake because you could have pretended that you go ahead with this, and you would have had to tolerate a few years of pro-Russian administration in Donbass. And then after a while, you would have been able to replace those people with a more loyal ones, and that way you would have kept Ukraine together, or you'd have kept Donbass as part of Ukraine. All you had to do was just, play a little safe and give them autonomy. And then there still would be Ukrainian currency circulating in Donbass. They would still have Ukrainian passports. They would still be considered citizens, just with autonomy. And he couldn't understand. He said, look, I really don't understand why they didn't do it, because they really could have had it without the war. And then, the conclusion is they preferred not to recognize any autonomy or any pro-Russian administration in Donbass, even if it meant that rejection of Minsk Accords would lead to a military confrontation. So in his judgment, they were not afraid of it, of going to the military solution, because they had the support of the West, and because they were sure the United States is going to give them everything that's necessary. They kept hearing these assurances all along, even before the 24th of February 2022. This is according to Lukashenko. So they decided to go for it and take it by force. So this is the about the past, the Minsk Accords. Now about the present. Lukashenko's assessment is that the fighting is very, very heavy losses. And usually the attacking side has heavier losses than the defending side. And that means, and that's confirmed by other sources. He didn't mention this, but I mentioned this from other sources, that from the beginning of the military offensive of the Ukrainians in June to now, which is almost mid-September, there's at least 65,000 casualties on the Ukrainian side. And of course, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of vehicles and tanks and so forth. Now, according to Lukashenko, he says to the Ukrainians and to Zelensky, you can't win. You cannot breach the Russian lines of defense. This is impossible. Not with the kind of weaponry you have. The Russians are superior in armor, in the supply of shells and ammunition, in the number of troops available, and in air force, etc., etc. So why are you doing this? He said, you are not going to be able to win in terms of breaking to the Sea of Azov. Now he does not understand why they're doing it, because that, from his point of view, is useless. And then he goes into the most important thing, which is the prediction and the advice. His prediction is that the Ukrainian forces are going to exhaust themselves, banging against the Russian defenses. And there's 3 lines, and they're building out the 4th line. And then once they exhaust themselves, the Russians are going to go into the counteroffensive. And then, and that's not me, this is Lukashenko, they are going to take Kharkov and Odessa, and most of the left side of the Dnieper River Ukraine, Russian-speaking Ukraine, what used to be called Novorossiya. And then Ukraine would be left to its core, which is the territory around Kiev. And then there's a big danger that the Poles are going to interfere, supposedly helping Ukrainians and going into Lvov, which is the territory they used to control. It used to be part of Poland before World War II, which Lukashenko thinks is very, very dangerous, because they could just stay there and keep it as if it is Ukraine, but in fact turning into Poland. And then the journalist asked him, what do you think if the Poles do get involved? And he says, well, Russia and Belarus will not allow it. This would give a chance to the Russians to and Belarusians to fight the Poles on the territory of Ukraine. Now, why is it such a big issue for Lukashenko? And that's my explanation, is because not only Lvov and Western Ukraine used to be part of Poland before World War I, but also at least half of today's Belarus was Polish territory before World War II. Now, just a note to those of you who don't know history of this region, this was part of Poland, but it was not Poland. It was actually Belarusians who lived there. They spoke Russian or Belarusian dialect, and they were Orthodox. And that's how you distinguish in that area. If you're Catholic, you're Pole. If you're Orthodox, you're Belarusian or simply Russian. So this was the area that the Polish state conquered from Soviet Russia in the War of 1920. And these are the borders that existed until World War II. And then Stalin made a deal with Hitler, and this territory was taken over by the Red Army, and the Poles to the present day consider it to be aggression against the Polish state, even though Belarusians considered that they were liberated the territories that were populated by Belarusian population, and that was Orthodox. But anyway, that's history. The point is that Lukashenko is very afraid if the Poles take over Lvov, that the next thing on the agenda would be to conquer half of Belarus, because it used to be part of Polish state before World War II, and that, he said, we would not allow, and we would hit with everything that we have, including nuclear, if they actually dare to go against us. But that's a side story. The most important point, of course, is here in this presentation, is that he urged Zelensky to sign peace now at the conditions that Russians today are willing to agree to, which is Kherson and Zaporozhye and Donbas, and that's it. No Kharkov, no Odessa. The territories that of those territories that Russia today proclaimed part of the Russian Federation. On something less, the Russians would not agree. However, he said, if you procrastinate, if you keep on fighting, then when they go into the counteroffensive, it would be too late. Then they will take over Odessa and Kharkov, and there'll be a rump Ukraine that would be useless to the Americans, since he would not recognize the loss of territory, they would not be able to join EU, and they would be not eligible for NATO. Maybe NATO will take them anyway. So it's going to be a continuous war and source of instability, even if some kind of a ceasefire is concluded. So that's basically his advice to Zelensky is, if you don't want to lose more, do it now. And the duty, according to Lukashenko, is to save lives, because every day of the war brings hundreds and hundreds, and they mount to thousands and thousands of young men who are losing it, and finally losing their lives. And finally, the last word is about the mood. They discussed, the journalist and he, the mood in Ukraine. And Lukashenko said that according to his understanding and data, Ukrainians are getting tired of the war. That all these mothers of tens of thousands of men who died trying to conquer back Donbas, they ask a question: what do we need it for? Why do we as Ukrainians need a Russian-speaking territory that doesn't want to be with us? Is it worth all these lives that are lost? According to Lukashenko, not. But according to Zelensky, yes. And a recent interview just in the last few days to an American broadcaster, Zelensky repeated in English that they're going to keep fighting, and that the end is not pretty, and then the end is not going to be nice, but they're going to keep fighting and fighting and fighting. Now they have this new hope for American long-range missiles and F-15s, and they, supposedly with all these Wunderwaffen, they are going to be able to win. So here's the conclusion. The conclusion is that the United States, in the face of President Biden, declared that Putin has already lost. Lukashenko thinks, unlike Biden, that Russia has not lost and is winning. And Zelensky should save as much of Ukraine as possible before it's too late. And then there are assessments of Scott Ritter and Colonel McGregor and some other American dissident opinions and watchers who basically say that Russia is beginning to win, and the tide will turn very quickly. Now, my personal view on all this is that it's not so simple that Russia will definitely go into an offensive very soon and win, because for some interesting reason, Putin is not in a hurry. If he were in a hurry, there would be much more action. In fact, there is very little action. As you look at the front day after day, you basically have the territory in the south, Zaporozhye direction, which there is heavy fighting, and then around Bakhmut a little bit, and then in Kupiansk in the Kharkov area direction, and that's it. The rest of the front has been stable for more than a year, which suggests that there is something else that Putin is planning, and I don't know what it is, but certainly not a all-out effort to win at this moment. So we shall see, but at least I think this is very important and interesting revelation of what President Lukashenko thinks. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe.